All right, today we are going to be learning about working with clay as a medium. And just like any other medium, before we can use it, we have to know what it's going to do for us, and we have to know how to control it. So first we're going to start with the properties of clay. And the first property of clay is plasticity. Plasticity means that the clay is malleable, that it is soft enough that I can bend it without it cracking. And this is the stage that we want to do most of our manipulating of the shape of the clay. The next one is shrinkage, and the entire clay cycle is controlled by moisture. As the clay dries, moisture evaporates and it causes the clay to shrink and kind of get tighter together. So we need to be concerned about shrinkage, especially when we are joining pieces of clay. We need to make sure that the stages of each piece are relatively similar. We also need to be concerned about shrinkage when we are making teapots and beads, anything with a hole in it where the hole might become so small that it actually closes up. Clay shrinks about 15% through the entire process of drying and firing. The next property of clay is texture. Different clay bodies have different textures. The clay body that we are using is a gray talc. It is a very smooth, kind of silky clay. The terracotta has a little bit more sand or grog in it. And we just need to be mindful of the fact that the clay body we're using should be appropriate for what we're doing with it. The clays that we use are good for both sculpting and making functional pottery with. We can also create real textures in the surface of our clay using tools. We can make impressions, we can carve into the clay. And the texture is what creates the most amount of visual impact, the most visual interest. So we really try to utilize the element of texture when we're working with clay. Moisture, as I said, is what controls the entire clay cycle. So we work with plastic clay. If we allow it to dry a little bit more, and it stiffens, but it's still moist. This is an example of leather hard clay. If I were to bend it, it would break because it is at a stage where it is more stiff and rigid. It also feels kind of waxy on the surface. There might be kind of a sheen to it that you don't see as much with the plastic stage. If we let that dry out a little bit more, actually completely, if we allow it to dry out completely, the clay is called bone dry. Also, it may be called greenware depending on the studio that you're working at. Bone dry or greenware is ready to go into the kiln and be fired, or I can recycle it by, we call it reconstituting. If I put this in a jar and submerge it in water, it will dissolve and it will become kind of a like pudding-like consistency. So this is an example of what your slip should look like. If I choose to fire it at the bone dry stage, then it comes out of the kiln looking like this. This is called bisqueware. It is a much more dense material. Also, I want to note that at the bone dry stage, this is the most fragile that your clay will be in the entire process of making anything. Wants you to listen to the sound that this makes when I thump it, and then compare that to this. It's a more high-pitched sound. Another change that we can observe is that it's also changed in color. So this is a brand new material now. It can never go back into the clay cycle. It will always be hard and it will be bisqueware. If I choose to put glaze on it, and fire it again for a second time, then we have glazeware. Glazeware is both decorative and functional because it seals the clay at the bisque wear stage. This is extremely porous, and if I were to fill this with water, I could come back in a few minutes and it would be sitting in a puddle because it's kind of like a sponge. Water will run right through it. The glaze adds color, but it also seals the bisque wear so that water cannot go through. Let's see. Yes, okay. So now the last one we can talk about is consistency. Before we can start working with the clay, we have to make sure that it is consistent throughout. We cannot have any air bubbles because, as I said before, the clay shrinks when it goes in the kiln. If we have an air pocket in our clay, air is a gas. Gases expand when they're heated, and it will cause your pot to explode. So, we cannot have that. What we do to prepare the clay to remove air bubbles and also to align the clay particles so that they're ready to work with and it's going to be at a state where we can work with it most efficiently, we have to wedge it. So we're going to kind of press it out with the heels of our hands. It's kind of like kneading dough. We're going to press it out and then roll it back up. Press it out, roll it back up. And what you want to see is kind of a swirling effect. So it's going to end up looking kind of like a conch shell. And if you have air bubbles, those are going to tend to be popping right along the bottom, sometimes in this area here. But we're making sure that we have a real consistent, thoroughly mixed medium. If we don't want to have areas of our clay that are drier than others and some softer than others, because as it shrinks, it may warp as it dries. Also, when we're building with clay, we need to make sure that the thickness is consistent. So that's another part of the property of consistency. We cannot have areas of clay that are too thick. The most we would want would be a 1/2 inch. Ideally, our clay is going to be about 1/4 of an inch thick. If it's any thicker than a 1/2 inch, that will tend to trap moisture. And when we put that in the kiln, the moisture becomes gas, the gas expands, and then we have an explosion. So now we can move on to the hand building techniques. We've talked about the properties and the clay cycle. We know about clay as a medium. Now we can talk about building with it. So our first and most kind of primitive way of working with clay, although it's very functional, cavemen made pinch pots, but we can also turn pinch pots into very beautiful vessels. So it's not an irrelevant method. We're going to start out with our wedged ball of clay. You should grab a little chunk off to set aside for a handle and any decoration that you might do later on. We want to make sure that this ball of clay is trying to make it pretty symmetrical, and also we should start with a refined surface. So any major cracks in the surface are only going to stretch, so we'd want to smooth those out first. Once I have a nice sphere, I'm going to stick my thumb into the clay in the center, and I'm going to, by feel, I'm going to make sure that there's only about 1/4 of an inch of clay between the tip of my thumb and the outside of the clay. Then I'm going to establish the height of the walls of the vessel. So I'm kind of pushing down with my thumb and pulling up on the outside of the pot. And this is not a very attractive looking vessel right at the moment, but it will become a very nice looking piece. So I did one complete pass around the bottom, then I can move up to the next level. So what we want to see is kind of the clay almost like rolling in on itself. So I'm pushing clay down on the inside and pulling it up on the outside. If we don't do this, if we're just doing more of like a lateral pinch, the bowl is just going to expand. We're not going to get a wall or any height to it. It's just going to become a big pasta bowl, which would be very challenging to drink from. So we first need to establish the height, and then we can work on refining it. Now that I have some height to it, I probably started with more clay than I need, so my mug is more of a cappuccino mug right at the moment. But now that I have established the height of the pot, now I can go and just by feel, I can try to refine the surface. So anywhere that it's thicker than 1/4 inch, I'm going to pinch until it's a consistent thickness. After doing that, then I can worry about refining the surface, going over and smoothing it out. All right, so the thickness is fairly consistent now. Now I can work on shaping it and also smoothing out any cracks in the surface. So anytime I'm working on the inside of the pot, I'm supporting it on the outside. That's very important. Clay it's like a little baby. You have to love it and, be very tender to it and nurture it. Make sure it has the right amount of water. And then at the end of the day, you gotta tuck it in and wrap it up for the night. All right, so this is a basic pinch pot. It ended up being very large, but that's the idea. All right, next we have a slab pot. So if let's say I messed up on my project and I need to start over again, that may happen to you. Maybe you decide to use a different hand building technique. We wanna kind of evaluate the moisture level. Is it cracking a lot? If I bend it, is it cracking? This is pretty good, but I'm gonna wedge, and you can see this dark area on the canvas. That's just evidence that moisture is coming out of the clay. So I'm gonna spray and add just a little bit more moisture to my clay body before I crush it down. I wanna do that while I have the most surface area to get the moisture back in. Now I can squish it back down, and I would want to re-wedge thoroughly to make sure that any air bubbles that I've created are gone. I will not do such a thorough job for the sake of time. So the next hand building technique is working with slabs. So I'm going to take off a little chunk, and I'm going to make kind of like a pancake out of it. I can do this starting with a sphere, or I can just start kind of flattening it out with the heel of my hand. This is, again, probably a little bit excessive amount of clay, but I can always trim off what I don't need. All right, so I'm going to set that aside to let that get leather hard. It's about 1/4 inch thick. All right, my wedged clay, I'm going to start in the shape of like a brick. And the idea of working with slabs is that you're going to create, it's almost like when you work with sugar cookies. You're going to roll out a big slab, and then you're going to cut your shapes out of it. What we need is a big long rectangle to make a cylinder. So the width of the rectangle will establish the height of our mug. The length of our cylinder, of our rectangle, will establish the circumference of the mug. So this is probably a good width to start with. And we need slats and a rolling pin. So, pardon me. So these are my slats. I make sure that they are the same thickness. I don't want them to actually be touching the clay because it is going to expand in this direction. All I need is that the slats are close enough that when I roll the rolling pin down, the rolling pin is going to rest on these, basically they're guides or guards that prevent your slab from getting too thin. So I'm going to roll all the way down to the slats using kind of quick back and forth motions. And so that is going to be the height of my mug, okay? This clay, and you can see it's kind of rounding out, curving. That's not going to give me a nice wide rectangle. So what I need to do is turn my rolling pin in the opposite direction and disperse some thickness to the corners. Then I can continue rolling. I'm using the guides, the slats to control the thickness of the clay. And if it gets round, then I want to go in the opposite direction and push the clay out. I have a fairly nice sized rectangle. It's not a perfect rectangle, but this can certainly be trimmed so that I have like the maximum area for my slab. I'm just going to use the slat as like a ruler, a straight edge, and trim off the extra. Whatever surface you're working on, you want to make sure it's not a smooth surface. So you'll see I have these canvas things. There's vinyl on one side, canvas on the other. We definitely want to be using the canvas side because the clay is not going to stick to canvas like it would stick to a smooth material like vinyl. All right, so this is my slab, and now I need to join these two ends. So what I need to do is slip and score. Scoring is kind of like cross hatching on the surface of the clay. You go in one direction and then back in the opposite direction. And then we do both ends, both pieces that are to be joined, and then we add slip to one of those surfaces. So get some slip on my finger, and I'm going to dab the slip on. If I were to wipe the slip on or smear it on, I'm just going to erase all of my score marks that I just made. And then I'm going to shimmy those together. I want to see the slip gushing out. That tells me that I used enough. Then I can take a rib. We have metal ribs, rubber ribs, an old credit card works. We also have wooden ones. And you're just going to clean up that joint or the seam. And ideally, it's going to look like it never even existed, like it was never there. And we should do that to the inside as well. Then I'm going to slip and score my cylinder onto the base. I can trace around it and around the bottom so I know where to score. And then I can actually trim off the extra. So that I have a cylinder built with slabs. I want to show just a very generic handle. We're just going to roll out a fat coil. And my handles and coils, I prefer to be kind of flat. A flatter handle is going to be easier to grab than a round one. A round one's just going to kind of roll around in your hand. A flatter coil is going to give you a better grip. Okay, so we want more of a fettuccine noodle rather than a spaghetti noodle. So I'm going to take the heel of my hand and I'm just going to kind of pat it out like this. Ideally, it will be a consistent width. All right, so that looks pretty good. Thinner in this direction, fatter in this direction. Then I'm going to lay it down like a candy cane in front of me. And with my needle tool poking straight out of my belly button, I'm going to cut it down to into kind of like half of a heart so that I have two nice vertical surfaces to join by slipping and scoring onto the pot. And it's important to make sure that your handle is proportional to the mug so that like the scale is appropriate. This may be a little bit big. My hand is pretty far away from the weight of the mug, so I might want to trim that up just a little bit. All right, that actually might be a little small, but it's a good distance from the weight of the mug. All right, that would be slipped and scored on. Your mug is going to have an original handle possibly, so you might use a different method to make it, but that's a traditional handle. The last hand building technique is a coil pot. We can either start with a slab base for the coil pot, or we can start with a little, like a mini pinch pot. So I could start with a little bowl shape. The slab base would make a flat bottom. The pinch pot is going to create more of a round bottom. All right. Then the idea of working with coils is that we're building with layers of kind of like rings. And kind of a coil building hack. You will be able to build faster with your coils if you kind of flatten them out, like I was saying with the handle, because we want it to be a consistent thickness. We want it to be about 1/4 of an inch thick, but if your coils are wider, then we can build faster with them. So the idea behind a coil vessel is that we are layering these coil rings, and if we want the pot to widen, then our next coil will be placed just outside of the last coil. The drawback to a coil pot is that it's more time consuming because you have to do slipping and scoring with each layer and also on the ends of each ring. So it's a little more time consuming that way. The advantage is that we have more control over the silhouette of the pot. I can have a pot that goes out and comes back in and goes back out and comes back in. Also keep in mind that you can use any combination of these 3 hand building techniques to work for your design. So you could start with a slab cylinder and maybe at the top, like if you wanted to come in, possibly use a pinch pot upside down and then cut a hole in it, or maybe if you were making like more of a sphere, you wanted maybe a baseball. I would start with a pinch pot on the bottom, maybe do a pinch pot on top with a hole, or I could build the rest of the top of that with coils. So if I wanted to come back in, then my next coil layer is just going to be attached more to the inside of our last ring. Then after they've been slipped and scored, the idea is that you want it to appear as though it was thrown on a potter's wheel. So we want to get rid of the evidence that this was coil built. So you'll want to blend those together. And it's still very important that we slip and score, or those cracks will reappear in the kiln. Scoring is kind of roughing up the surface. We're creating nooks and crannies and burrs that are going to kind of tangle together just like Velcro would. The slip is kind of like the glue that's going to solidify that seam. Let's see. Then finally, cleaning up, we need to make sure all the clay stays off the floor. So first you're going to just clean up your tools a little bit, kind of pick off any extra clay that might have gotten on there. You can use other tools for that. We want to return our tools by sorting them well. And then we'll put our project away. If the clay if you want it to stay plastic, you're going to want to use a damp paper towel. And that is going to run underwater and then wring out so that it's just damp. It's not sopping wet. And you're just going to drape that over your clay. You may also want to wrap your extra clay in the paper towel. Maybe put your extra clay inside your mug to store it. And then it goes in a plastic bag. It's always going to go in a plastic bag until we're all done with it. So just like some bread, if you're too lazy to put the twist tie on, kind of twist it a couple times and then tuck the open end of the bag under it and place it on the appropriate shelf. Your project is put away. Any extra clay that's still soft can be put back in a clay bag. Then we need to pick up our work surface, whether it's canvas or one of these wooden bats, and carry it like a lunch tray over to deposit any clay crumbs into the garbage. The clay, if it gets on the floor, it's going to dry out, it becomes brittle, it gets stepped on and turns into a fine dust that gets stirred up into the air as we walk around the room, and it's very harmful to breathe, very hazardous. So you guys fortunately are in here only 1 hour a day. I am here 8 hours or more every day. So please help keep the room as clean as possible for my health and for yours. Your hands may have clay on them. There's a bucket in the sink that you can rinse your hands off, and the clay will go into the bucket. It'll settle on the bottom, and then I can skim off the water after it's settled. I think that's about it. So have fun and be creative and enjoy working with clay.